We are live. Good evening. Welcome to Garden Hour, brought to you by SDSU each week at this hour. I'm Rhoda Burrows, SDSU Extension Specialist, and I will be your host this evening. Tonight's panelists will include Adam Varenhorst, Entomology Extension Specialist, and we are delighted to have with us Lisa Marotz, Director of McCrory Gardens, and myself. So Adam, what will you be talking about tonight?
I'll be talking a little bit about some of the pest beetles that we might start to see, the sap and picnic beetles, and then also the multicolored Asian lady beetle, and why sometimes it's not always a beneficial insect and sometimes it's a pest, as well as grasshoppers, and then a couple other insects that we are still receiving a lot of calls about. So I thought I'd touch some information on those as well.
And Lisa, I presume that you're going to be talking about some beautiful flowers.
I plan on it, yes. I'd also like to share with each of you a little bit about Garden Party, what's growing on right now, and then what we have anticipated to happen in September.
All right. And among other things, I'm going to talk a little bit about different kinds of fruit shrubs, and we often get samples of berries that people bring in and say, is this edible? So I'm going to talk a little bit about how to tell the common ones apart. So we will get started with Adam, and I will call up his slides. Whoops. Take it away, Adam.
Right. So as I mentioned, the beetles in these pictures are a couple of the problems that we start to see this time of year. In some cases, they can show up a little bit earlier, especially in sweet corn. But right now is when we start to receive calls and questions about these. So on the left side of the screen are picnic beetles, and both the picnic and sap beetles are relatively small. Black to brown beetles. The picnic beetles can be differentiated from other small beetles because they have, like you can see in the picture, they range from yellow to orange, but 4 irregular shaped spots. And so the sap beetles, depending on the species, can be dark brown to black. Most of the times they won't have the very easily observed spots. So with both of these problem pests, the beetles, as you can see in these pictures, they show up on fruit of either tomato, apples, really anything that gets overripe, or if it has an injury. And so the problem with these pests is once they show up, they tend to congregate. And if you have an apple that maybe has a small blemish, they will turn that small blemish into a rather large one. The same thing's true with any other produce, really. So anything that's really ripe is going to attract them into the garden. And then once they're in the garden, they tend to just kind of move around and look for anything that they can feed on. You can go to my next slide. So like I mentioned, these are attracted to ripe and decaying plant materials. So you can imagine, especially with our plants being a little stressed, if you get ground falls, that can really draw these beetles in. And as I also mentioned, they typically are more of an issue if you have some previous injuries. So a lot of times I see these on apple trees. The apples will have had a little bit of injury. Maybe another insect caused a small blemish, and these picnic or sap beetles will show up and take full advantage of that. Now with these beetles, another thing they can do is they can introduce fungal pathogens, and that further accelerates decomposition, and in turn, a lot of times also draws more beetles in. And so you can end up with pretty large populations of these beetles. Now, sweet corn, it's a little late if you're seeing these in the sweet corn, but I've had numerous calls in the past Typically, it's more the end of July, really early August when these are starting to show up, but they'll feed on the developing kernels of sweet corn as well. So you can go to the next slide. In our next pest, we normally consider a very beneficial insect, the multicolored Asian lady beetle. However, this time of year, when food sources start to dry up, they like aphids and other soft-bodied insects. When they can't find those anymore, they'll start to move into whatever they can find. And just like the picnic and sap beetles, they'll head into fruit and vegetables that have blemishes. Most of the time, I get calls about these in apples. And as you can see in this picture here, they like to congregate. They'll do some feeding. So if there's a small wound, they'll excavate that area out. And bigger issue is if you've ever grabbed a multicolored Asian lady beetle, you know that they have a very distinct odor. That odor actually can get left behind in the food. And so one of these beetles can ruin, if you don't pick out the apple that has it in, or you leave the apple that had these infested, you got the beetles out, it can ruin whatever you're making because you'll be able to detect that flavor even after processing and cooking it. These can also be a big issue for vineyards. One multicolored Asian lady beetle can ruin an entire batch of wine. So you can go to the next slide. So what can we do? I consider these guys to be invaders this time of year. They invade the garden. So step one, remove any ripe, damaged, or diseased fruit. So if you have something, instead of picking it and tossing it into maybe the open area of your garden, or if you have ground falls for apples, instead of waiting to pick those up later, remove them now, and not just make a pile of them. You need to either bury them, or if you have a trash service that has a bin that you can use for yard waste, put them in that. You want to get these as far away from your place as possible, from your garden with your other produce or your fruit trees, because it's just going to be a continuous problem. Now, I don't have them up here. There are also several species of wasps that are attracted to this overripe fruit as well. So it's really beneficial just to keep your garden very well clean, keep it manicured. Don't have rotting fruit and other things around, because that will just attract more insects, especially this time of year. They're looking for food. Overripe produce really has a strong odor that brings them in, and then there are sugars there, so they'll be going after that. Now for these beetles, you can make bait traps, and there's lots of options if you look those up. Some of them say to use a bucket and pour in stale beer, and then put a little bit of dish soap so the beetles will go in and they get the soap on themselves and they can't go back out. Another thing you can do, if it's the picnic and sap beetles, especially if it's in apples, you can soak the apples, submerge them in cold water. The beetles will typically try to get away from the cold temperatures, remove themselves from the apple, and that can help. That doesn't work though, like I mentioned with the multicolored Asian lady beetle, because if they're in the fruit, it's going to have that taste, smell. There's a chemical that they produce that's what causes that smell, and you'll be able to detect it. So for instance, if you make applesauce or you just try to eat an apple that had them in, you're going to be able to taste that odor, that flavor, and I don't recommend it. So those are kind of the things. So if you have multicolored Asian lady beetles, the best thing to do is if they're in apples, just toss the whole apple. I know it seems pretty wasteful, but that's the best way to avoid having any issues with flavor. So you can go to the next slide. So grasshoppers, I know I talked about these the last time I was on Garden Hour, but they continue to be a problem. And there's, again, the main three species here. So the differential on the left, two-striped in the middle, and then red-legged on the right. The differential and the two-striped are going to be the larger species. However, I know there are a lot of red-legged grasshoppers out in the environment this year. So the question I've been getting is, what do we do about them? They're all over the garden. Really just watch if stuff's starting to get ripe, pick it and then ripen it the rest of the way inside. On things like green beans, these will cause blemishes on beans, but you can cut around those. On tomatoes, if you start getting a lot of grasshopper feeding, that'll essentially destroy them and draw in the picnic beetles. So pick tomatoes a little bit earlier than normal before they're really ripe, and hopefully that will slow these down. I don't recommend treating for grasshoppers this time of year because most of what we can get over the counter from stores for insect management just isn't going to have the strength to really knock the populations of grasshoppers down. It takes a little something extra, and then you also have to worry about how long you have to wait before you can harvest the food after you spray those things. So best course of action is just to try to keep ahead of them as much as possible. You can go to the next slide. And so defoliation during this time of year isn't as much of an issue, but like I said, really watch for when they're feeding on the produce. And as I mentioned before, and we've been getting a lot of calls about blister beetles, and we've been noticing a lot in the drier parts of the state. Blister beetles follow grasshoppers essentially around. And if you have a large grasshopper population, the following year, you're going to have a very large blister beetle population. Blister beetles feed on grasshopper eggs. And so large grasshopper populations equal big food source for the blister beetles. And so we don't worry too much. We've had some issues in the past with blister beetles feeding in gardens. A couple species can be really bad defoliators, but the bigger issue is if they're on the plants, you want to avoid trying to get any contact with them because they do produce a chemical called cantharidin, and that will cause blistering on your skin. So best course of action is if you're trying to remove them from plants, put on some nitrile gloves. Don't do it barehanded. We don't typically recommend spraying for blister beetles, but if in next year in the spring, early summer, they get really bad, it might be an option. But we'll talk about that when that comes around. So next slide. And we're still hearing about squash bugs. So at this point in the season, we're getting a little bit further along. A lot of areas are already seeing the nymphs and adults in the gardens, but continue to monitor. You can powder for these, especially if you're waiting for stuff to finish off. Powder, that'll keep the plants going for a little bit longer and keep those populations at bay. You can go to the next slide. And I know I talked about this before, but I have to bring it up again because in the last few weeks, I've had over 100 calls, and I know Amanda Bachman in the central part of the state has as well. We are still seeing a lot of cicada killer wasps. Now I have in here not murder hornets. The reason that's there is so many of our calls are concerned that these are the murder hornets that are in the news out in Washington state. They aren't here yet, and we'll keep an eye out. The USDA is going to continue monitoring that situation as well. But as far as we know, still pretty much over in Washington, and it'll take a while before we see them ever make it to South Dakota. Now, the reason people confuse these is cicada killers are large and they can look menacing. So one of the things though is that they're typically not very aggressive. They might buzz by you. Typically, if you have one buzzing around your head when you're out in your garden or in a flower bed, that's probably a male. Males can be territorial, but the thing with the males is they don't have a stinger, and so it's all show. They're just trying to make you leave their area. These are going to be attracted to bare patches of soil, sandy soil. So this year with dry conditions, there's a lot of habitat for nesting for these guys. So in the future, if you don't want them around, instead of spraying, one of the things we recommend is removing the bare patches. So if that means reseeding grass, putting ground cover, whatever you need to do, but that'll slow them down. The females can sting. It's not very often that people get stung. And these do kill cicadas, so they do serve a pretty important role. Otherwise, cicadas could be a bigger problem. They aren't really, and part of that's because we have a lot of cicada killers. So you can go to the next slide. And this is what the nests look like. So this was obviously taken during a year where it wasn't quite as dry as it is right now, but just a little bit of bare dirt in a lawn, and you'll see an area of dirt being excavated. If you stand around long enough, you'll see the wasp either coming out or going in. And so they dig the hole, and then they carry the cicada down in there, lay their eggs, bury it, and then they move on to the next area, and then they might dig another nest. So that's what they do. And the next year, if you have cicada killers now, you'll probably have cicada killers next year because that's where they're emerging and they kind of figure out an area they like. And so they typically stick around there. I don't mind having cicada killers. I at one point in the year when my dill was in full bloom, I probably had 30 cicada killers in the garden. I was working around them, and the males might buzz by my head a few times, but in general, not a big issue, and I never was stung. So kind of a general rule of thumb I typically give people with most pollinators, so bees and wasps, is if they're on the flower, they don't really care what you're doing. If you get too close to the nest or to where they're trying to make a nest, then they might get aggressive. So kind of keep in mind where you're at. And also, if you do have a lot of wasps, look out for those nests. And that might be a topic for a later thing because we will start to see those. So you can go to the next slide. And this is just a picture of a cicada killer actually carrying a cicada to give you guys an idea. That's if you see something carrying a cicada, that's what it is. Next slide. All right, that's all I had.
Thank you, Adam. And I don't see any questions about insects, but I have one. The cicada, let's stop share here. The cicada killers, how do they overwinter as adults? Or
they actually overwinter, I believe, as larvae, and then they pupate in the spring, and then because they're feeding pretty much until they pupate, and they are down in the soil, so that gives them a little bit of more protection from the cold temperatures, since the wasps dig pretty deep to make those nests. So, but they overwinter down in the nest, and then they'll pupate, and then they emerge the next year as adults. So just an interesting little insect, and I guess not little, it's one of our biggest ones in South Dakota besides praying mantises. But you know, we try to spread a lot of information about the benefits of these guys, and they are pollinators as well. But you know, we don't like to hear people spraying for cicada killers because they are one of our least aggressive. You know, if you have another wasp species that might be aggressive, we understand spraying those, but for the most part, these guys are a little bit more docile and, you know, don't have a huge negative impact on our lives.
I got stung by a hornet earlier this summer. I was stupid enough to actually try to move the nest and learn my lesson quickly.
Yep. Yeah, we don't recommend moving nests without protective equipment. So
I haven't been able to get in my shed since, but thanks. And again, everyone who's listening, if you have questions about anything that Adam has talked about, or you have other insect related questions from your yard and garden, you're welcome to type it either into the question and answer box or the chat box at the bottom of your screen. And Lisa, are you ready to tell us something about McCrory? We'll go from the good, bad, and ugly to the pretty, hopefully.
Let me do my best here to share my screen. Thank you. I'll do the start from the beginning.
There we are.
Let's see. I want to get rid of this piece. I talk myself into thinking I don't know what I'm doing, and then that's how that ends.
If you go to the little icon down at the bottom, just to the left of the slider bar, there you are.
Am I good? Okay.
Yep.
Very good. I go backwards. All right. Well, thank you for the opportunity to spend some time with you here at the garden hour. I have been the director here at McCrory Gardens this is my 5th summer. One of the greatest honors I had, I feel, with this year's garden party is that we were able to commemorate all of Norm Evers' work, recognizing his time, 20 years as the director here at McCrory Gardens. We had a various number of speakers and certainly a lot of people that came to help us remember Norm and the work that he did here at McCrory Gardens. In addition to just overall 43 years being at South Dakota State University, Norm passed away on December 31st last year, and this just brought forward the need for remembering where McCrory has come from and how we remember where it's come from, and always remembering that this is where our basis is. These are our roots, are the people that came before us, and we want to continue their work as best as possible. I want to show you the next slide. What do you guys usually find you can change slides?
I use the wheel on my mouse. There
Okay.
you go.
There you go. Yeah, it was a great night. So I'm talking about Friday night, August 5th is when we did Norm's commemoration. We're sitting out on the yard of the cottage, and the cottage was one thing that Norm brought to McCrory Gardens. It was a great showing of people who know and appreciate the work that Norm did. And especially to have Norm's son Colin there and his wife Heidi. They are right here in the center of the picture. We've got the McCrory crew listening in from the side there. Again, just recognizing the work that Norm did was so important that night. And this is one of my favorite pieces here, Norm's grandson, Connor. So if you know or knew Norm at all, perhaps you can see a little similarity here between Connor here and his grandpa Norm. He shared just some very heartwarming memories of his grandpa, also not only just the plants that he loved, but a good cigar and also bird watching. And if you can't tell, this was one of my highlights because I've known Connor since he was a middle schooler probably. So through my kids and band and that sort of thing, Connor did show up, surprised some of his family, came here from Chicago for the garden party. What Norm started as well, he started the garden party, and it was the tradition of the SDSU ice cream social and also having jazz music playing. And Dr. Corliss Johnson right here, he was at the very first garden party in 1988 as well. So I was glad to have someone capture a picture of Corliss that night. Whoops, apologies. Okay, we at McCrory, we've been hoping for getting in some partnership and some collaboration with the Native American students or the American Indian students here at SDSU. And Dr. Mark Freeland and one of his students, Paige Kane, they came and planted this Three Sisters garden right on the lawn of the straw bale house that we have here at the gardens. A lot of it, the purpose of it was to show people what a Three Sisters garden is, the sweet corn, the pole beans, and squash. But we also wanted to show people mainly that here is turf that we really didn't do much to in order to get it prepared in order to plant the corn, bean, and squash. And I do make note on here that this was pre-raccoon. We are not without our own raccoons here. I've named our raccoons Rocky and Johnny Dollar because they are just those mischievous little film noir kind of characters that come in the night and take away our goods, just like at our homes probably. And this is just a shot where Chris, our manager of horticulture and grounds, had grown some native plants, native species then in our greenhouse space, and has also placed those right into the turf of the straw bale house yard, and then this Three Sisters garden in the back. Next year, the hopes for this would be to have all of the names of the plant in both Lakota, Dakota, and English listed throughout here, as well as what the story of this Three Sisters garden is. Now this is today. I just took about 10 steps out of where I get to work, and this is what I saw. the bright and blooming plants that are right outside of the Education and Visitor Center. And this one just makes me giggle a little bit because this is a place where, as we look at the next picture too, people are wondering, oh, you know, they're talking about how beautiful it is here, and they haven't even left where the terrace gardens are yet. They still have another 23 acres to go. This is just going around the corner. I like to point out all of these annuals. Our garden crew starts from seed. We rent greenhouse space on campus proper and begin about 60,000 seeds in that greenhouse space. And I marvel every year at how these pots unfold and what they will come up with next. I'm showing our Joe Pie weed. This is Big Joe. We have Little Joe elsewhere throughout the gardens, but we are starting to see monarchs coming back. We hope that we are continuing to be on their migration path. The Joe Pie weed is very popular with them. See if I captured a better picture. I wanted to capture one of this button liatris on the corner as well. They are fully in love with that button liatris. Those that know monarchs better than I do, I think it's the purples that they really like. Last year it was the English asters that they were after especially too. I'm moving ahead to what September looks like for us, and I plopped this in here as One Day for State is coming up on September 2nd. We do participate in that. It's a big fundraising opportunity for the entire campus and for our supporters to come forth and help us out as they feel that they can. There's also a block party that everyone's invited to, and that's from 5 to 7 p.m. right outside on the lawn of the foundation building. Another fun thing we have coming up, our annual insect festival. As you can see, we are planning to have hissing cockroaches again. And then, so it's September 11th from 10 until 2. We have Amanda Bachman particularly with us. We also have Christina Lind, who is now working for Ecdysis at Blue Dasher Farm. We are the hosts of the day. Please take note of the pollinator parade. Come dressed as your favorite bee, moth, butterfly, or beetle. And we hope to have a nice giant critter caravan going through the gardens. We'll have a food truck here. We won't expect you just to eat the insects that I think Brett Owens is going to be bringing. We also are having a photo contest, and we're having an Assemble an Arthropod Contest to be held, which you should be able to see on Facebook here very soon on how to submit those photos and also find out what Assemble an Arthropod Contest means. We also have our annual party on the porch, which on September 12, 19, and 26 here at the Straw Bale House, we have live local music. We are having Oak Lake String Band on the 12th, Plum Crazy on the 19th, and Kyle Knutson on the 26th. We'll also have a cash bar and a food truck on those days. More information on Facebook or on our website. I wanted to put this out here because when we look at what One Day for State stands for and also other giving opportunities, I am the fundraising arm of the crew here at McCrory. But we have our general fund. We have specific gifts that support children and youth programming. So that would include sponsoring the Insect Festival, but more so it offers scholarship opportunities for kids of all ages that want to come and participate in our youth programming and they maybe can't afford it. We have those funds to help them out. Ideally, this would grow enough so that we can have programming here for youth all summer long at no cost to anyone. We're also remodeling, in process of hoping to remodel the cottage. We have annual garden glow, which we had over 11,000 people come to see the lights at a botanical gardens in South Dakota in December, which is thoroughly amazing. And then Tulipalooza. We just purchased our annual allotment of about 15,000 tulips that we will be planting in let's see, end of September, early October. There's a plethora of opportunities to volunteer if that's ever anything that you're interested in as well. And then we have our memberships opportunities here too. I do have a McCrory Minute here I could share later on. It was just what the day looked like, an average day at McCrory Gardens, but we can hold on to that one and show it later if we want to at the end.
Thank you, Lisa. I sometimes one of my bigger regrets of being in West River is not being able to keep up with the gardens and see what's going on there. But for those of you who are on the east side of the state, be sure you take a chance to go and see what's going on. We have one question that I don't know if you want to answer this, Lisa, or if you want me to take a stab. Is a Gallardia an annual or a perennial?
I would have to look that up. I'm a party person and that not a
horticulturist. The answer actually is both, depending upon the variety and whether or not it's a hybrid. Some of the Gallardias have been bred with between annuals and perennials. So some of them are annuals and some of them are perennials. So it just depends on the variety that you have. And some of them seem to be sort of what we call short-lived perennials. So when you buy it, you'll have to look it up and that particular variety up and see what it is. And I had a question about Adam, for you on an insect, and our pollinator insects has plentiful in past years. I know I've heard some debate back and forth out here in Rapid this year, especially earlier in the spring when we had those really weird temperatures, that maybe some of our apples didn't get pollinated because the bees just weren't there.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of variation, I think, from year to year with their activity, and with the really warm temperatures, we won't see bees be quite as active during the heat of the day if it's really warm, because that's not a time point and heat point that they want to be active during. They're going to seek shelter just like we probably do. But you know, my observations this year, being out in flowering crops like sunflower, it's pretty similar as what I've seen in the past. The other thing is just kind of looking at the different bee species that are present, but there are a lot of the native species seem to be doing well, and that's typically what we see out in those. And my pollinator garden is doing great right now. The other thing for the bees, depending on where you're looking, is making sure you have plants that are very attractive to them, and that you have flowering for as much of the season as possible. Because if you have all early or all late, you will notice a drop off because they're going elsewhere for that food. They're going to go where the food is. So that's all I have. And for the other question, Rhoda, the one on tomatoes, depending on the spots, without seeing it, it's a little hard, but that could be stink bugs.
That's what I was thinking too. I was going to turn it back to you.
Yep. So if it's stink bugs, you typically would see several of those spots per tomato. And at this point in the season, there's not much we can do. That happened a while ago. And if you don't see a lot of stink bugs in the garden, chances are there were some nymphs developing and they probed around and fed a little bit. And that should still be fine though, for the most part. On tomatoes, they can cause a little bit of a problem, but they're more of an issue on some of our other products. So that would be my take on it.
I had a similar one, Adam, that came in to me today with, instead of tan spots, small tan spots, there's small black spots. And my first thought was bacterial spot or bacteria speck, but each little each little spot has a whole dead center.
Yep. That's kind of the thing we look for with stink bugs. Also, a lot of our true bugs that feed with those piercing, sucking mouth parts is. But stink bugs are the bigger species of those. But when they pierce, it's going to be that nice spot in the center. And then what happens is they'll suck some of the plant juices out, but that also can open an entry spot for some other diseases. Because once that skin's serving purpose of keeping things sterile inside, and so when we pierce that and open that up, we can get some other issues, and also just the saliva going in, and that'll cause some breakdown as well. So yeah, it's probably, we were talking before we started tonight, Rhoda, but even the stink bugs are probably looking for moisture this year. So
Yeah.
tomatoes are high moisture and they have a soft skin, so they're probably a prime target for that.
And speaking of moisture, we'll go back and look at some tomatoes here. Another issue with tomatoes, and you may recognize this slide from a couple weeks ago where I put up the ideal temperatures for tomatoes, and 80 degrees is kind of where we'd like to have it be for the high. And of course, that just doesn't happen in South Dakota in the summer. So we can see some issues. And I bought, this isn't the tomato I bought, but I bought some tomatoes at the farmer's market the other day and noticed they had some of this white thickening. Sometimes it can get fairly hard on the inside of the tomato, and we call that white core, is, well, at least one of the names for it. And that's caused by heat. So if you've got that on your tomato, some varieties will develop that more easily than others. So if you tend to have this year after year, you might want to try some different varieties, maybe some heat tolerant varieties. And on to fruiting plants. I've been noticing a lot of pictures on social media of different kinds of fruit, and is this edible, and you know, what kind of fruit is this? And I decided to start with the elderberries, which at least in my yard are about at this stage right now. They're not quite turning dark yet, but are starting to a little bit. And elderberries, one of the ways to have a pretty good idea if it's an elderberry, well, if you look at the big panicle of fruit, of very tiny fruit, there's not really too many other fruits that can be mistaken for the, they're about 1/8 inch, 1/4 inch in diameter, so very tiny fruit. And the other way to look at it is that the elderberries have a compound leaf versus a simple leaf for most other fruit. And the compound leaf, to tell the difference between a compound and a simple leaf, is to look for a bud right where it joins the stem. So there aren't little buds here on those little leaflets. It's only at the base. So if there's only one at the base, that tells you it's a compound leaf, and that's what we see with elderberries. I've seen elderberries and chokecherries get mistaken for people that haven't looked at these a whole lot, and you can see the structure of the panicle that the fruit is attached to. So it's a big long central stem, and then the little fruitlets are coming off that little stem. So that's how it attaches to the main stem of the shrub. These are also all single leaf, simple leaves. So they could be mistaken for other kinds of fruit if you're just seeing the leaves, but once you look at that structure, that's one way to tell them apart. Another one that we see that's called sometimes chokeberry as opposed to chokecherry. I prefer the name Aronia, which is the scientific name, and I think it's a more pleasant sounding name than chokeberry. Aronia is actually native to the eastern part of the US, but it can grow fairly well in South Dakota and is a beautiful ornamental shrub. It has you can kind of see it's got these dark green glossy leaves. They're very glossy as opposed to Juneberry or even chokecherry. And they turn a beautiful red fall color, red and orange shades. So it's very nice as an ornamental shrub. But getting back to the fruit again, if you look, you see that these various parts of the fruit kind of connect in clusters to this main stem. So instead of coming off in more or less single stems, they're a little bit more clustered, and the clusters themselves are sort of ball up a little bit more. Instead of being long and thin, you've kind of got little balls. You can also see they've got a bigger scar on the blossom end than the chokecherry does. And they can be, this shows them as kind of dull. They can be kind of shiny depending on how ripe they are and so forth. So those are two similar tasting fruit that will grow in South Dakota. The chokecherry, of course, is native here also. And we actually even do have some yellow chokecherries out here in the hills. So you can't always go by fruit color when you're trying to distinguish something. So going back again to tell a fruit apart, one of the first things I ask people when they're wondering what kind of fruit it is, or when they bring it in, I'll look and see, does it have one central pit like a cherry? Or does it have several seeds inside? So that's one of the first things to look at. Is it a pitted fruit, or does it have multiple seeds? And then the next thing you can look at, well, of course, you look at the structure like I just showed you of how it's attached to the plant, or how it's attached to the fruiting stem. And so here we have all single pitted fruit, chokecherry, which many of us are kind of familiar with. Viburnum, these are grown as ornamentals for the most part. Our native viburnum nannyberry has fruit that you could use in like jams and jellies, but you notice how different the attachment is for the fruit there as opposed to the chokecherry. But the other thing to look for is the arrangement of the leaves on the stem. Are they alternate? One on one side, and then you drop down a little bit and there's another on the other side, as opposed to opposite leaves where there are like twin leaves, one on each, pairs of leaves, one on each side of the stem attached at the same spot on the twig. So that's another clue to look for when you're trying to tell fruit apart. And of course, I just threw in buffalo berry, but it looks quite different. The leaves are very different. That sort of sage green. So that's, you probably won't need all these other clues when you're looking at a buffalo berry, but I just threw it in. And then multiple seed. So this is more like an apple. Some of these are pome fruits, aronia and juniper, juneberry. So these are like apples that have the little seeds. So related to apples, and in fact, many of these can get fire blight as well. But Aronia again has the alternate leaves and those bright, shiny, beautiful glossy leaves. Whereas the Juneberry has alternate leaves also. They're softer green. And the fruit is usually a more, tends to have a bloom on it, or sort of a layer of light color over the top of it. So those could look a little alike. If you taste the fruit, the leaves are quite different looking. If you would taste the fruit, you'd know in a hurry whether it's Juneberry or Aronia, because Aronia will has that chokecherry type of tannin, high tannins, versus the Juneberry, which is kind of like a mild blueberry for the most part. And then, of course, we see the structure again of the elderberry, which is completely different. You can see from the Aronia. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about buckthorn, because that is a shrub that we might see. It's an invasive shrub, so we try to get rid of it whenever we see it. Minnesota's had a big buckthorn eradication program for a number of years. And here we say they're sub-opposite is the technical term, but they're almost opposite. They're almost in pairs, but they're just slightly offset. And we see the veins on the leaves come together both at the stem end as well as the far end. Those veins start converging again at the tip, and that's pretty distinctive of buckthorn. The growing point at certain times of the year and during the winter actually forms a real sharp point that actually you can stab yourself with. So those are some characteristics, but looking at the fruit, so maybe somebody just brings in a twig and no leaves. If you look at the attachment of the fruit of the berries to the stem, it's not coming off a central stem like we see with our other fruit here. It's actually each stem of each fruit is attaching directly to the twig. So that's another way to tell buckthorn. And you really want to know the difference between buckthorn and aronia or chokecherries, because buckthorn is somewhat toxic. Basically, it will clean out your digestive system very quickly if you take some, and you'll notice that even the birds pretty much try to avoid buckthorn. So that's another clue. If you go out in the wild and it looks like a shrub is covered with berries and there aren't any birds eating on it, that might be a pretty good clue too. So let's go back to our questions. And it looks like right now we just have one more, and that was for Dr. Ball, who is not here tonight, but you were wondering about putting on the plastic tubes on new trees. You want to get those on before the deer start rubbing on them. And I think it'd be okay to put them on now and make sure they're loose so they get good air circulation underneath, and make sure you get them all the way down to the base to help protect that tree against chewing of rodents as well. And with that, if there are no more questions, I want to refer you to the SDSU Extension Garden Hotline, which is free to South Dakota home gardeners. Well, actually, if you're out of state, we'll take your question too. We sometimes might refer you to somebody in your own state, but if we have the answer, we'll get it to you. We have 3 regional centers with horticulturists manning the email and the phones, so that you're welcome to send in photos on the email. The phones can't take the photos, but on the emails. And we'll get back to you usually within a few days if somebody's not there to take your call right then. They're not in every day, but they're in every week, and we'll get back to you if you leave a message. You're also welcome to go to our extension.sdstate.edu website and click on the garden and yard. And if you drop down, you'll see a problems and solutions selection on the drop down menu. And there's a place there to fill in a form with your question, and you can submit a picture with that as well. And we have people across the state and then actually across the nation who can answer those questions on that. So you've got a lot of options of getting your questions answered. And of course, you're welcome to bring them back next week or through September to Garden Hour. And if you want, you can email us ahead of time with photos, and we can put them up on the screen so everybody can see the photos as well. So lots of options there. And with that, I want to extend a thank you to our panelists tonight, Lisa and Adam. Thank you, both of you, for sharing your time and your expertise with us tonight. And remind you that you can go back if you want to look at anything that we talked about tonight. You can find this recording online. And thank you, Lisa, for showing us some great photos of McCrory Gardens there.
You're more than welcome. If I could have walked the whole gardens with you, but this is, yeah, just that first view, and good golly, there's so much more.
It's peaceful just watching that fountain.
Isn't it though? Maybe I could add that to our website. Click here.
There you go. Yeah.
Thanks for having me join your group.
It's our pleasure. With that, we're going to end a little bit early tonight. John Ball wasn't able to be with us tonight. I believe he will be back hosting next week. So be sure that you get your questions to us, because that's why we're here. With that, thank you, everyone, and good night.